This is one of my favorite modern holidays, as folk tradition varies so widely around it that it originates from a non-Christian origin. It is preceded by the 40-day fast of Lent, where Quaresima, a folk spirit and effigy of Calabria, Italy, is hung. She is called commonly as the wife or sister of Padre Eterno, of Carnevale or Mardi Gras. She is one of the current incarnations of Persephone in southern Italy, and typically she's dressed in black, like a widow, because the father of Carnevale or Mardi Gras is burned. And because he's burned, he dies, and she ultimately mourns him for 40 days. And her symbol is this reminder of mourning, and also this kind of reminder that you should fast as well. And this is a preparation. You'll also notice in a lot of medieval and Renaissance magic and the Goetias that they will also talk about a fasting period. And most religions around the world around this time have some kind of fasting tradition. It's springtime, so that's why you'll find this, because most traditions seasonally, coming from ancient times, you would shed some weight, you would fast, you would get cleansed for the new year. This is one of the other somewhat Gnostic interpretations of Easter. It's a time for cleansing and renewal of the body. You're, in a sense, just as Christ is resurrected, you also resurrect from this time of darkness, which is winter, that we're coming out of. An Italian tradition that many cannot even bear to witness is the rite of I Battanti. This is a public ritual where men dressed in red literally bleed for Christ by flagellation of their thighs. They literally beat themselves with blocks of nails and then whip their blood sometimes, or smear their blood on a cross and a church or wherever they are. It's an ancient ritual of bleeding for the divinity. And you can find similar rituals to this biblically. They're also in the Bible speaking of the rites of Baal, and the priests would flagellate themselves and bleed. You find it in Goetia magic as well, in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. Sacrifices, animal sacrifices, Moses and spilling the lamb's blood in the doorways. I mean, it's everywhere. Blood sacrifices everywhere in the ancient world, and it still exists. And this happens to be human blood, and that's some of the most magical blood of all sometimes in magic. Another tradition from Italy focuses on the earth aspect of the holiday and the ancient goddess. Offerings such as trays of wheatgrass are out on altars in Bova. Offerings such as trays of wheatgrass are sometimes offered on altars to Christ. This has that grain connection, as in Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, sometimes with little red ribbons around them representing the blood of Christ. And in Bova, Italy, there is another tradition where there's what's called the mothers and daughters, and they're these essentially effigies made out of palms and flowers, and these are marched through the streets. What's interesting about this is the mother and daughters is that there's almost this iconic theme of Demeter and Persephone, the mother and the daughter. Now, this celebration literally has nothing to do with Christianity. As much as the first one I had discussed. It literally has nothing to do with it. It has nothing to do with Christ whatsoever specifically. It's a totally ancient tradition that fused with Christianity, probably because it was so ingrained the church couldn't stop it from happening, and it didn't really go against Christianity, and so it kind of fused together, which leads me to my next point, the Easter bunnies. What do Easter bunnies have to do with Easter? I always wondered about this growing up. Easter bunnies? Why bunny? And then the eggs. It makes no sense. They don't lay eggs, and especially different colored ones, the way we paint them. I mean, chickens, have different shades to their eggs naturally, but, what does it have to really do with anything? Well, they're an ancient custom that was absorbed into the Easter tradition, like all the other ones I had just mentioned. Originally, the Phoenicians saw the rabbit as an incarnation of the goddess Astarte, who each year in April would descend into the underworld for 3 days to resurrect her dead lover Adonis. The festival became so popular in ancient Rome that it fused with Christianity, and this festival is what became the Adonia, or the Festival of Adonis. And this, Astarte was synchronized with Aphrodite, Venus, and this is where this tradition came from originally. The Easter egg was also an ancient symbol of eternal life, and the red egg is a symbol of Mary Magdalene, which is so interesting. When she presented the red egg to Emperor Tiberius, claiming Christ was resurrected and had achieved eternal life. The goddess Astarte, who today in Catholicism is embodied in both the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, being both the mother and the lover. Even though Mary Magdalene isn't technically the lover, a lot of people believe she is. There's a current of people who believe she is. I kind of like it. It's not technically historically accurate, but, she's become what we want her to be today. And I think Mary Magdalene is the lover for Christ. I'll talk about this in another video, but she, it definitely fulfills this sacred role that I think she's owed and deserved. Whether they were lovers or not, I have no idea. I don't think anybody will ever know. But it's kind of a nice image to think about. And maybe Christianity deserves a new mythology or an altered mythology, just as the rest of them had different altered mythologies throughout the ages. So I don't think it's something we should necessarily mock or throw away. But again, going along with the story back to Adonis, it is said that in, the myth, he was fostered by Venus, Aphrodite, Astarte, and as he grew older, he fell in love. And one day while he was hunting, Venus told him not to, and ultimately he was killed by a boar in the groin. Very interesting. And the goddess in distress fell from heaven. Now, really interesting, this fall theme, very similar to the biblical fall of Lucifer, the fallen star, or the fallen morning star, which Astarte is a manifestation of the planet Venus, and it's also called Lucifer in Latin. Lucifer taking on both the male and female aspects here. Upon Adonis' death, the goddess's tears became opium poppies, and his blood became red roses, as recorded by the Greek poet Pagan. I think that's really interesting. Mourning, tears, and opium, and then this passionate blood becomes red roses. Really interesting symbolism there. I also find it really interesting with Our Lady of Sorrows and how she is depicted with the 7 swords, very similar in a concept to Astarte going to the underworld, the 7 dimensions, and shedding a piece of her clothing to rescue him. Very interesting connection there. This is all important because at this point, Adonis descends to the underworld and becomes a denizen of hell in the realm of Persephone. The chthonic incarnation of Astarte Venus, better known as Ereshkigal in the East. For 3 days, it was understood, for 3 days, he was in the underworld, and then he was resurrected. At this point, if you're familiar with the death of Christ, you will know that he died and descended into hell for 3 days, and then was resurrected, as it states in the Apostles' Creed. Today in Italy, just as it was done in ancient times for the Adonia, the festival of Adonis, pots of sprouted wheatgrass of many colors and ribbons, especially red, are placed around sprouts as an offering. And also, this was also made, these were pots made by women with quick sprouting things such as fennel and other things that were also used in ancient times. But today it's typically wheatgrass is the offering. This custom is so ancient. Again, it takes on the embodiment of the earth and can be traced back to ancient Egypt, where the god Osiris was seen incarnated into barley. This barley was then baked into bread in a physical shape of him. Now, this is important because in today's modern Italy and in modern Greece, there are Easter loaves of bread baked in many different shapes, braided typically with red eggs placed in them. Really interesting connection there. Eggs were also used by the ancient Etruscans to represent immortality and eternity. And you can see this on some of the frescoes with the Etruscans. You'll see the deceased person holding an egg. And again, this goes back to that Orphic concept of the Orphic egg, immortality, the divine presence, the all of everything. Another interesting aspect of Easter is it's a non-fixed day in our modern calendar because it's a lunar holiday and falls on the full moon. So really interesting thing in Christianity because most of the days, if I'm not mistaken, are really solar holidays. I mean, Christmas is a solar holiday. Most of the other ones seem to fit our modern day calendar on fixed days of the year. The Easter is really one of the only ones that actually floats around, which is so fascinating. And because of this, Christ takes on a lunar aspect. He's thus, in this instance, a lunar deity, just as the Greco-Roman god Dionysus was perceived sometimes as a lunar deity. And many people make the connection between the two. I think sometimes a little too much. I don't necessarily think that Christ is the new Dionysus, as many people claim, or he's a copy of Dionysus. Or he was stolen, Dionysus' imagery was stolen with the wine and the bread and all that. I don't necessarily think that. I think this was just a Mediterranean thought at the time with bread and grapes and wine and resurrection. I think these are just very similar concepts floating around that just ended up being applied to Christ. I don't necessarily think anything was stolen, per se. I'm not a big fan of that stolen commentary that I hear a lot of people say. Modern pagans say, neo-pagans are very, everything in Christianity is stolen. They're not entirely wrong, but it's not also entirely correct either. It's just as everything else. It's what came before it, essentially. And, Dionysus is also equated with Adonis and Osiris in ancient times, just as people equate Christ with them in modern times. There's nothing wrong with it. If you want to see it that way, that's fine. If not, that's another thing. I know a lot of modern pagans are strict that these are all different deities. More people in the archetypal, psychological current of thinkers and that agnostic, ways of thinking will say these are just archetypes and they're all the same. They just vary from culture to culture. Whatever you believe, it's fine. Nothing here is entirely wrong to think of it that way, and none of it's entirely, right or wrong, I guess is what I'm trying to say there. It's just your perception on it. And it's a similar energy, different manifestations of it, we could get into Neoplatonism at this point, but I think that's even going too deep into this subject at this moment. But I will have another video on that. So in the end, before you disregard the holiday of Easter, remember that while it's still a Christian holiday, it also venerates natural forces. The embodiment of Christ in the lunar aspect of the day is very strong, even though it's never spoken about typically. The church never talks about these things, of course. Even though, it's Christianity, as we know it, practices a lot of magic. The altar, when you look at it, and they, have a lot of pagan influence, but it's never spoken about by the church, of course. Personally, I see Christ more of a saint or an ancestor, or as my friends in the Afro-Caribbean and Brazilian traditions might say, an orisha. which is just another term for a god in a sense, but more on the ancestral veneration aspect of it. And this is kind of the reason why I celebrate Easter, for its pagan elements and its seasonal and lunar connotations. It's still a holiday of the earth and sky in a way. It's really an ancient festival. If you want to replace the names, of Christ with Dionysus, that's up to you. I tend to see Christ more as a Gnostic being, something more of light. He's the Lucifer Christ. But again, I'll talk about that in another video. This has been your host, Salvatore, talking about Easter and the Gnostic connections and the Italian pagan connections that are still present today. And I'm definitely going to have more of topics like this, talking about Christian and the survival of paganism through Christianity that, I think a lot of people, modern pagans especially, want to throw out Christianity altogether, and they don't like reading the grimoires because it has a bunch of Christianity in it, and everything's got to be neo-pagan today, and there's a lot of power in the whole Christian mythos, and it's not ultimately different from anything that came before it, and I think we should respect that for what it is and go from there with it. And with a more Gnostic understanding of Christianity, it puts it into a whole other perspective that you probably are not even presently aware of if you've never studied it from that angle. But if you want to definitely hear more about these topics and topics like it, please subscribe, like, and share my content, and I will see you for another episode on the South and Magic.